There are probably few things that are more precious to us in life than our memories. I would imagine everybody here would agree with that. There are probably few things that are more precious than our memories, and there are probably few things that are more frustrating than forgetting our memories. But you realize, I realize, we all know it, that forgetfulness is just an unavoidable inconvenience of being human. And the older you get, the worse it gets. Now, I'm only, and I have to look at my wife every time, I'm only 32, right? Yeah. I'm only 32. And see, that's a problem, that I'm 32 and I can't tell you. I'm only 32, but I spend a lot of time just trying to remember what it was I know I forgot. Now, I'm just going to be honest with you. This might really offend some of you, and this might really hurt your feelings. But I love everybody here this morning that I know and that I know well. I love you, and I appreciate you so much, but sometimes I can be looking right at you, and I couldn't tell you your name to save my life. And I've known you for 4.5 years now. Forgetfulness is one of the unavoidable inconveniences of being human. We forget what we want to remember, and we remember what we want to forget, don't we? How often have you thought, has some life-changing thought come to your mind, you thought, I don't need to write this down. I mean, this is life-changing. I will never forget this. There's no way this is too monumental. There's no way that I'm going to forget this. And 5 minutes later, that thought has passed away and it cannot be resurrected. I keep on my phone a kind of a little notepad where I text to myself thoughts about sermons because I can have this thought about the glory of God that I'm like, I don't think anybody in Christian history has discovered this. I mean, this is magnificent. This is monumental. This will change the world. And then literally 5 minutes later, I'm like, no, what was that monumental thing that was going to shake the whole world? As we age sometimes, and you probably agree, sometimes it feels like we spend more time trying to remember what it was we were doing than we actually spend doing anything. Forgetfulness is, if you want to put it this way, it's a humorous tragedy, isn't it? There's a story about a salesman who was going door to door in a neighborhood, and he came to this one particular house, and there was this beautiful dog sitting in the yard. There was this old man out in his garden working, and he got talking to the old man, and he asked the old man, what is that dog's name? And the old man just kind of stood there for a minute, silently staring off into space, and he finally said, what is that flower? That flower that everybody gives on Valentine's Day and stuff, it's usually red and it's so beautiful. It's got a great fragrance and it's got the thorns on it. What is that flower's name? And the salesman said, you mean a rose? And the old man said, yeah, rose. And then he turned around and he said, Rose, what's the dog's name? Forgetfulness, it can be funny, but it really is no laughing matter. Memories are precious to us not just because of how they make us feel. They're precious because our memories are the records of how we became who we are. That's why we're so careful to guard them. That's why we rehearse them. That's why we pass them down to future generations. There are some memories, there are some moments in life that are so priceless that we will do absolutely everything in our power to make sure that they're preserved and that we never forget them. Yet the truth is, eventually the sands of time will cover even the most memorable moments of our life. The reality is, without reminders, we will not remember. Even the things that we think we'll never forget, without reminders, we will not remember. I think this is true in every area of life. It's why we take pictures. It's why we write journals. It's why we share stories. There are things, our children's lives growing up, our childhood memories, there are things that we just don't want to forget. So we memorialize them in pictures on the wall and in books and stories. But there is something more important in life to remember than your childhood. There's something more important to remember than your favorite vacation. There's something more important to remember than even a deceased loved one. There's something more important than remembering how old you are. That's why I don't worry about forgetting it. You might ask, what could be more important than those things? And the answer to that question is simply the faithfulness of God. How many things, now I want you to be very honest with yourself this morning, how many things has God done for you that you swore you would never forget, you swore this was life-changing? How many things has God done for you, but now you can't even remember that you forgot it? Has God ever spoken to you in such a clear way as you just knew? And I'm not talking about something even magnificent or something miraculous. You just know that God spoke to you, and it was a life-defining moment. And now it's been so long since you've even thought about it, you don't know if you could tell the story. Has there ever been a time when God has provided something you were praying for in such a concise, such a decisive way that you knew it wasn't that just coincidence that God came through because He was the only one that knew about the need you had? And now it was so clear at one time, and now it's just all become kind of a blur, and you try to tell the story, or Melody or myself stands up here and says, does anybody have anything they want to share about the goodness and the faithfulness of God? And everybody just kind of sits there staring off like, I hope she don't ask for specific names. And the reality is God has actually done something this week, but I just can't quite tell you what it was. Can you recount the faithfulness of God in a more detailed way than just to say, God's been good? I think many of us have doubtless forgotten much more of God's goodness than we remember, because if we are not intentional about preserving the faithfulness of God in our own memory, we will forget it. So I want to kind of ask the question this morning, how can we combat this? And the answer is actually probably a little more tangible than you would think. I want to challenge you this morning. The way that we combat forgetfulness about the faithfulness of God is the same way we combat it in life. We take pictures, we write journals, we do intentional things to remember. The same way we combat forgetting the faithfulness of God is by intentionally memorializing important moments. We're going to look at Joshua chapter 4 this morning, the first 9 verses, really the whole chapter, but let's put our focus on the first 9 verses. Remember, Israel has just come to the Jordan. God has enabled them to walk over on dry land, and now they're facing Jericho. Joshua chapter 4, verse 1 says, it came to pass when all the people had completely crossed over the Jordan that the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from every tribe. And command them, saying, take for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the midst of Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet stood firm. You shall carry them over with you and leave them in the lodging place where you lodge tonight. Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, 1 man from every tribe. And Joshua said to them, cross over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and each one of you take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. That this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, saying, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for memorial to the children of Israel forever. The children of Israel did so just as Joshua commanded. They took up 12 stones from the midst of Jordan, as the Lord had spoken to Joshua, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, and carried them over with them to the place where they lodged, and laid them down there. Verse 9 says, then Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant stood, and they are there to this day. My idea, my theme this morning, the thing I want to leave with you is really very simple. And again, it might actually be a little more tangible than you want to think about it. We tend to make everything so spiritual that we forget God has made us physical creatures for a physical earth with physical reasoning. So my thesis, my idea this morning that I want you to leave with is that it is important to intentionally memorialize important moments. It is important to intentionally remember the faithfulness of God. Of course, God was well aware of Israel's propensity to forget. I love one thing, there's so many things, but one of the things I've thought a lot about recently that I love about God is that He never forgets anything unless He chooses to. You know, the Scripture says that our God doesn't forget. He remembers everything from generation to generation, yet the Scripture tells us that He has chose not to remember our sins. He's a God who does not forget anything except for the sins of His people. He puts those behind His back. He erases those. It's as if those never happened. Yet other than that, God does not forget, but God knows that we do. God knows that because sin exists in the world, that we are a forgetful people, that literally our brains, our inner workings have been affected in such a way that we can't remember everything we're supposed to. God, knowing that Israel would forget this moment when the priests literally stepped into the Jordan River, and as their feet touched the water began to part, and it piled up on one side to the right and to the left. The river just completely dried up. And Israel, probably over a couple million people. You say, well, how do you know there was a couple million people? There was at least 40,000 men that passed over prepared for battle just from 2 tribes at this point. That's just from 2 tribes. If you think there's 40,000 men, that's not including the men, the women, the older men, the women, the children. That's just in 2 tribes. It's very likely that there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that crossed this Jordan at this point. And they all crossed over, not through mud puddles. They all crossed over on completely dry land. God did this. Here the priests are standing in the middle of the Jordan. The water is a wall on one side. The water is going on the other side. And the people are crossing over. But God knew even a moment like this, Israel would forget it. And God knows because He knows everything. But God also knew from experience that Israel would forget. You remember He did something much greater than this when He dried up the Red Sea? And then when Israel when they came to Canaan and they saw all the things that were going on in Canaan, they said, we can't take it. They had already forgotten what God did at the Red Sea, how God had wiped out the greatest army of the day, the army of Egypt. God knew that Israel would forget, so He literally instructed Joshua to erect a monument in memorial of the miracle that He had performed for them at the Jordan River. God wanted to make sure that this moment was not forgotten. This crude structure, these 12 stones, were to serve as a constant reminder of the power and the provision of God for generations to come. Now notice, God did not God did not instruct Israel to tuck this memory away in their heart. That's what we always say, just tuck that away in your heart. I don't understand that. How do you tuck something away in your heart? Right? God doesn't say here, tuck this away in your heart. What God says here is, I want you to take 12 big rocks and I want you to pile them up. God tells Joshua to take these 12 men and you take these 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan and you stack them on the other side of the Jordan. This is not a spiritual metaphor. Literally, this is what they were supposed to do. It was not what they were, but where they were from that made these rocks meaningful. These were just ordinary rocks, but they served as a testimony to an extraordinary moment. These rocks weren't made of gold or silver or pearl. They probably weren't shiny. They weren't special. In fact, they had probably been smoothed off from the constant run of the water over them. These were just 12 ordinary rocks, but they exemplified an extraordinary moment. It's not what they were, but where they were from that made this important, because these rocks were in the middle of the Jordan, where the priests stood. Now, we know the Jordan is anywhere from about 3 to 10 feet deep in most places. So in the middle of the river here, they're probably looking at about 10 feet of water. I don't care how strong a man is. There's very few people, if any, that could take a big 30, 40, 50-pound rock and put it on their shoulders and swim out of 10 feet of water to the other side. These rocks didn't come from the side where it was 2 foot. These rocks didn't come from on the banks. These rocks came from in the middle, and here they are stacked up. This is a constant reminder that God had literally parted the waters for His people. These rocks only arrived where they were because God had made for a way for His people to walk through on dry ground. Now, I'll say this, and I say this honestly. Walking on the water is amazing. What God did through Peter is an amazing thing. Walking on the water is amazing, but can I tell you, walking through is as equally impossible without God. Walking on the Sea of Galilee was a wonderful thing for Peter, but walking across the river Jordan on dry ground was just as much the power. It required the power of God and deserved to be memorialized. The very existence of these 12 rocks from the river stacked by the river was a testament to the power of God. Now I want you to notice there's a command from God, stack the rocks. But in order for the monument to make it, there had to be obedience from the people of God. In verse 5, they were instructed to carry these rocks on their shoulder. These aren't little pebbles. These aren't softball-sized rocks. These are big rocks, rocks that can be seen, rocks that a man has to get under the weight of and carry to the other side. You see, these were large, heavy rocks. This was a lot of work. Memorializing the moment actually required some effort and some intentionality on the part of God's people. This was certainly work, but it was work that was worth doing. For generations to come, there was a monument standing on the banks of Jordan that memorialized the faithfulness of God. Those rocks used to be in the middle of the river. Now they're standing on the side as a memorial. Look what God did. So my encouragement to you this morning is simple. I want to encourage you to do the work necessary to memorialize the faithfulness of God. And I mean that. Don't just tuck it away in your heart. I mean literally this morning, I'm encouraging you to figure out personal ways to do intentional, physical things where you can look at something and say, that reminds me of God's faithfulness. I want to encourage you literally, build an altar, take some rocks, and write on those rocks the things that God has done for you and lay them in a pile somewhere. Write a journal. Okay? Etch a date in a piece of wood or something somewhere where God answered a prayer. Do something that you can literally look at and be reminded, this is what I asked God for and this is what God did. Because if you are not intentional to remember, you will forget. You'll hate it when you forget it, but I guarantee you'll be happy that you did what was necessary to remember God's faithfulness. Now I want to show you real quickly, and I do, hopefully, mean quickly. I want to show you this morning a few things that these rocks did for Israel. So I'm encouraging you to actually do things, whether it's writing a journal, whether it's building your own little memorial, whatever. You know, kind of the idea I have in my mind right now, I'm building a rose garden in my front yard. And what I want to do is I want to take one little spot in that garden, and I want to have, it's going to start out with just one rock. And every time God answers a prayer, every time God does something that only God could do, I'm going to add a rock to that pile. And what I'm hoping one day is the rock pile will be so big it takes over the garden. And I guarantee you, when people come to my house, they're going to look at that rock pile amidst this rose garden, and they're going to ask, is he offering sacrifices to Baal? What's going on here? Right? But then I can have an opportunity to tell them, look, I want you to look at this rock. This rock says June 20th. God did this. This rock is from 2019 where God answered this prayer. These rocks can actually do things for us, and however you choose to do it, I'm encouraging you to make memorials. And I want to show you what these memorials did for Israel and what it'll do for us. Number one, I want to show you that these stones provided teachable moments for future generations. Now, this is the most obvious of the three we're going to look at, and according to the text, this was the primary purpose of the memorial. The stones were actually meant to start conversations. Verse 6 tells us that one day, God says to Israel, one day your children will come to you and they will say to you, what do these stones mean to you? Now I want you to imagine a child walking along with an old man. You grandparents, think about your grandchild. You're walking along through the side of this little river, and all of a sudden you come upon this massive pile of rocks, and your kid looks at you and he doesn't just say, what do the rocks mean? The question is, what does the stones mean to you? Verse 7, when that happens, then you shall answer them. The waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial to the children of Israel forever. Imagine that old man with his child, and the little grandchild looks up and says, Grandpa, what did these stones mean to you? And a little tear comes in Grandpa's eyes because he remembers what God did, how God did the impossible and brought them over on dry land. And he has the chance to look at his little grandson and say, let me tell you what God did for me. And he's not just saying, let me tell you what God did for me. What he is essentially saying is, let me tell you what God will do for you. Tangible things have a way of opening up conversations and providing teachable moments. One of the greatest gifts you could leave to your family is a gift they don't even know about, and that's just a little journal of God's faithfulness. Imagine one day, maybe when mom and dad are no longer here, and you go into the house and you find this little notebook, and you open up that notebook and there's just dates in there. God did this. God answered this prayer. God saved this person. God was faithful. You know already, you've had it happen, probably a kid, whether it's a child or a grandchild or even a neighbor comes over, they see something in your house and they ask, what's the point? What's the meaning behind this? What if we memorialize the faithfulness of God the same way we do vacations? And what if instead of people asking about, hey, about the time you went to Hawaii, what if people ask, what is this random rock sitting here? Right? Or what's that little journal on the coffee table? Or what's that inscription over the door mean to you? What if your grandchild came and asked you, what do these stones mean to you? And you had to look at them and say, I really can't remember. Memorializing what God did for you matters because it will give you the opportunity to tell others, especially the next generation, about the powerful faithfulness of God. Look, it's a wonderful thing if you can look at your children and say, God's been good. It's a far better thing if you can tell them how specifically that God's been good. When we build these memorials, however you choose to do it, it will open up chances for conversation with future generations to tell them specifically about the power, the faithfulness of God. Your memorials will open doors to tell others, especially specifically your own family, about how good God has been. Number 2, these stones also provided courage for upcoming battles. I think the location of this memorial definitely was not accidental. There's no things that are accidental with God. Notice God commanded the people in verse number 3. He said to carry these rocks over with you and leave them in the lodging place where you are to lodge tonight. Verse 8 tells us that they took the rocks, they obeyed God, they carried them over with them to the place where they lodged, and they laid them down there. That seems insignificant until you ask the question, where was it they were lodging? Where was the camp? Verse 19 tells us where the camp was. The Bible says in verse 19, the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. When they crossed the river, the first place they come to was a place called Gilgal. Gilgal is facing Jericho. Gilgal is where they set up camp for the first time. But it's not just where they set up camp. Verse 20 tells us they took those 12 stones, which they took out of the Jordan, and Joshua set them up in Gilgal. Now, you can automatically draw the line and think, well, yeah, Gilgal's facing Jericho, so I see how this works. But it's bigger than that. The reason that Gilgal was such an important place is because it became the command center for the conquest of Canaan. This means that it's very likely that every time Joshua and the leaders were preparing for battle, they did it in sight of these stones. When the army went out to fight, they likely marched by the memorial on their way out of camp. Each and every time they faced the enemy of God's people, there was a memorial there to remind them of what God had done, what God could do. When I speak of future battles, when I say that these stones will provide courage for future battles, when I speak of future battles, I'm not just referring to those battles without, but to those battles within. As believers, we're going to fight battles in this world for God and with God, but even bigger than that, as believers, we're not just going to fight battles in the world, we're going to fight battles in us. When I talk about battles this morning, I'm not just talking about the battles on the outside. I'm talking about the battles on the inside. If the people of Canaan served as any type, they would have been a type of the flesh. Of course, God's command was that they were to make no alliances with them. They were to completely drive these people, the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, all of them were to be driven out of the land. And the reason they were to be driven out of the land, because if Israel did not drive them out of the land, if Israel negotiated with them, if Israel made covenants with them, Israel would end up worshiping the false gods that they worshiped. They could not coexist with the people of the land because their God was different. The people of the land would doubtless have pulled the people of God into their idolatry. Therefore, God instructed Israel to drive them completely out. You see, the people of God could not live in victory as long as they allowed the people of the land to live at all. In the same way, the spirit and the flesh cannot peacefully coexist. The flesh will dominate the spirit if the old man, the old nature, is not put to death. I find this to be so true in my own walk. If I do not actively die to myself moment by moment, if I miss a moment dying to myself, before I know it, the flesh has control of everything. And sometimes before I know it, it's been a week and I've been out of step with God for a whole week. Oh, it doesn't change that I have a relationship with Him. It doesn't change that He loves me. But I've been out of step with God because I gave the flesh a little space. The spirit and the flesh cannot peacefully coexist. The flesh will dominate the spirit if it is not put to death, in the same way that the children of the land, the Canaanites, would have dominated the Israelites if they were not driven out. And you might be thinking, what does this have to do with what you're talking about, building rocks, building stone borders? If you're wondering what this has to do with that, allow me to show you. Verse 24, God said, when you do this, it's going to be not just so that all the people of the earth will know, but when you do this, it will be that you may fear the Lord your God forever. This memorial was erected as a constant reminder of the faithfulness of God. But notice this, seeing the faithfulness of God would call the heart of the people to be faithful to God. He said, when you do this, it'll be a constant reminder of what I've done, and it will cause you, the people of Israel, to fear the Lord forever, to have a proper respect, a proper adoration of God and who He is. You see, remember, it is the goodness of God, Romans tells us, that leads us to repentance. Recollecting on the faithfulness of God, when we think about what God has done, recollecting on the faithfulness of God will call us to commit to faithfulness to God. When you stop and think about how good God has been, it stirs up something in the heart that then says, how can I be unfaithful to Him? How can I sin against Him? If He's been this good, this powerful, this faithful, how can I be disobedient? Memorializing the faithfulness of God will encourage you to faithfulness to God. In future generations, not only will the children see what God did, but you will be reminded of what God did, and you will fear the Lord your God forever. Memorializing Jordan may very well be the thing that gives you the courage to face Jericho. When the enemy seems bigger, not just talking about the flesh, but in general, in ministry, in life now, when the enemy seems bigger than you are, it may just so happen that you open up your Bible and you come across a note written in your own handwriting where God was faithful and God got you through when you thought there was no way. You come across something in your Bible, in your journal, in your yard, where you laid down a stone and you said, God was faithful here. You'll come across that, you'll see that, and you'll be reminded how good God was, how God overcame what you couldn't. And then when you face Jericho, all of a sudden Jordan will come back to mind, and you'll remember that God can do it again. In the heat of battle, getting a glimpse of an old war memorial will give you the courage to keep fighting. There's a third thing, that's number 3. The stones inspired hope, I think, in difficult seasons. Now, I don't know if you caught it in the text we read, but there was actually 2 separate memorials that were set up. Look with me again at verse 9. Of course, there was the memorial in Gilgal, but verse 9 says, Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan in the place where the feet of the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant stood, and they are there to this day. When this book was being written down, when it was being recorded, whoever's writing this book said, when this happened, Joshua set up a memorial there in the middle of the Jordan, and that memorial is still there. Now, this memorial was set up to prove that what happened really happened. You know, anybody could say, we walked across the Jordan on dry ground, and these stones are from the middle of the Jordan, and somebody might say, yeah, prove it. Right? But when you look out in the middle of the Jordan and you see a monument out there in the middle of the Jordan, you know that either somebody drowned to set that up. They didn't have cranes. They didn't have the things we had today. Somebody would have had to give in their life to set a memorial up out in 10 feet of water that you could see above the water. Right? They would have had to know that something miraculous happened here. This memorial was set up to prove what happened. But that's not actually what interests me about it. At the time the book of Joshua was recorded, of course, this memorial was still standing, but this memorial could only be seen a few months out of the year. If you look back, remember we talked about last time when God parted the waters in Joshua chapter 3, when God parted the waters, it was during the spring. This was during the early harvest. This was when the Jordan overflowed its banks at that time of the year. Like I said earlier, the Jordan's normally 3 to 10 feet deep, somewhere around 100 feet wide. But do you know when the floods come, when the spring rains come and the floods come, the Jordan at some places can become a half-mile wide? This little, basically what honestly is nothing more than a creek, it's not much of a river, can become a half-mile wide. It can become an absolutely raging, dangerous torrent. Well, that's what was going on when they crossed the river. Remember, the scripture tells us that the priests, the Levites stood in the middle of the Jordan until the whole host was over them. They came up out of the Jordan. And verse 18 says, and it came to pass when the priest who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord had come from the midst of the Jordan, when the soles of the priest's feet touched the dry land, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. Now I want you to see this here. The 12 stones in the middle of the river would have only been visible in the dry season when the river retreated back to its normal depth. When the river was overflowing its banks, this memorial that Joshua set up in the middle would not have been seen. The stones became most visible when the rain was most absent. Now follow me here. What better time to be reminded of the faithfulness of God than in a dry season? The stones in the middle were not only a confirmation of the crossing, they were a reminder that the rainy season was sure to come again. Remember, this didn't just happen when the river had turned to a puddle. No, this happened when the river was raging that God did this. Just the fact that this memorial was there reminded them of the season when the river rages. I hope you see what I'm driving at here. The stones became most visible when the rain was most absent. The stones in the middle, they were not just a confirmation of the crossing. They were a reminder that the rainy season was sure to come again. Let me tell you something. Dry seasons are an inevitable part of the Christian life. There are seasons in the Christian life when God is speaking, when things are moving and shaking in the church. There's times when things are just moving forward, when you're seeing fruit for your labor. Those times are wonderful. Those times are good. There are times in the harvest when the whole river is overflowing its banks. But if you've been a Christian very long, you know there's times when everything dries up. And you wonder, where is the God who parted the waters? And not just where's the God who parted the waters, where are the waters? What happened? Everything's changed all of a sudden. It's in those times when you feel dry and your soul feels brittle. It just feels like it's going to crack. God's not speaking like he was speaking. Things aren't moving like they were moving. It's in those times when you literally feel like your soul is about to crack, and you look out in that puddle that's supposed to be a river, and you see 12 stones standing there, a monument. You remember that God one time parted those waters, that the dry seasons don't last forever. The rainy seasons will come again. Seeing that memorial in the dry season will give you hope to keep moving forward. Dry seasons, honestly, dry seasons are confusing. Because, you go out of a time when God is just working, then all of a sudden it seems like everything's just come to a complete standstill, and you're thinking, is it me? What did I do wrong? And when we go back and forth, dry seasons are confusing. They're fruitless. You don't see the fruit of the labor. You're still doing the work. But let me tell you something. When the rain's not coming, the plants aren't growing. Dry seasons are discouraging because nothing's happening. But the reality is dry seasons are just that. They are seasons, and no season lasts forever. The fact that they could see the stones would be a reminder that a couple months ago they couldn't. Our memorials, when you set a memorial, when you write in a journal about what God did, when you share the story with someone about how God was faithful, it may very well be that that person who you told about God's faithfulness will come back to you in a dry season and say to you, remember when God parted the waters, remember that it's going to rain again. Our memorials will remind us in the dry times that the flood season is only a few months away, and with the rain always comes the early harvest. Memorials repeat our own story back to us, and they encourage us to be confident that God will be faithful. So what am I telling you this morning? Build an altar. Keep a journal. Take a picture. Do something on purpose to make sure you don't forget God's faithfulness. And you think, man, there's no way I would forget crossing the Jordan on dry ground. You want to bet? You want to bet? Israel had already done it once before. And they crossed more than the Jordan. They crossed the sea, and they'd already forgotten. Build an altar, keep a journal, lay a stone. And I'll tell you this, when you do that, you never know who your altar will minister to. In this text, the primary reason for this altar was for future generations to see it and ask, what do the stones mean to you? And to be able to recollect the faithfulness of God. But I honestly see so much more in the text about what these stones did for the generation that did it than even the future. It may be that when you lay a stone, whatever that means for you, it may be for you in the face of battle in a dry season. You may come back across that altar and remember God and be encouraged to keep going. It may be that your altar is for somebody else. What a gift it really would be. Something you wouldn't see with your eyes, but what a gift it would be After your family has laid you to rest and as they're going through your things, that tedious process of cleaning everything out, they come across a little brown leather book and they unwrap it and they just look in there, and in your own handwriting, they just see 1-line, 2-line notes with dates on it of when God came through, exactly how he did it. It may be that your memorial becomes an international testimony to the glory of God. Why do this? God says in verse 24, why do this? That all the people of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty. One may think, but building memorials, that sounds good, right? But that's for the pastor. That's for the people that are visible in ministry. You might think building a memorial is only for people who get big answers to prayer. A building memorial is only for people who see God part the waters. Can I say to you respectfully, every answer to prayer is a moment worth remembering. Every time God comes through is a moment worth remembering. You see, you might think, well, my little things, these are just puddles. But people have drowned in puddles before. It doesn't matter whether it's a puddle or a river. One may think my prayer, what God did for me, was not that big. But people have drowned in puddles. If God gets you through it, it's worth remembering. I'll show you the picture of a man that I admire so much, George Mueller. George Mueller had an amazing prayer life. And it's a good thing he did, because he sure wasn't a looker, was he? Right? I mean, he had a prayer life, but the face I'm glad he could pray. George Mueller is one of the most memorable men in recent Christian history. He began recording. If you know anything about George Mueller, he had an orphanage that supported over 1,000 kids at a time usually. But George Mueller didn't take support. He didn't go around and get support from local churches or anything like this. He made a purpose that in his ministry, in his life, he would do one thing and one thing only, and that was only tell God about his needs, nobody else. So he began recording some of these things down, and he came up with a brilliant title to his book. He titled it, A Narrative of Some of the Lord's Dealings with George Mueller. In his little journal, he began to write down the things that God was doing for him. This daily journal of answered prayer ended up covering several years. This several years of prayer that he recorded, and I've read part of this, and it's amazing. I was actually going to read some of it today. The reason I didn't read some of it is because some of the wording and some of the numbers are things we don't understand. So let me just put it in basic modern English. He would say, today God provided $6 for the orphanage. It was the exact amount we needed to buy food for the night. The next day would say, we woke up with no milk this morning, but a milk truck literally broke down outside, and the milkman gave us all the milk before it spoiled. The next day or the next week, we didn't have any money for breakfast, but we had this children sit down and thank God for the food, and the bread truck showed up and said, somebody has bought you all of this bread. He recorded those day after day. I looked this week, if you downloaded this on Kindle, now this little journal of George Mueller's is published, and it is a 6-part series containing over 31,000 pages. Or maybe I said that wrong. 3,100 or 31,000. It's still amazing. 31,000 or 100 pages of nothing but testimony on how God provided every day from morning to evening. I remember one time he wrote in there, they only had one suit of clothing, and the tailor came and said, come to my shop, someone's paid for you a new suit of clothing. Just little things. They weren't a big deal. You know what I'm stressing to you? Future generations have come to rest under the shadow of his memorial. They have been encouraged to believe God for their Jordans. And you might think to yourself, yeah, but I'm not a great man like George Mueller. Let me tell you something. Neither was George Mueller. In that time, when he began writing this, he wasn't a great international, well-known man. You might not be a great man like George Mueller, but George Mueller wasn't a great man like George Mueller. All he did was recorded how God provided breakfast that morning. All he did was recorded how God provided new shoes for the children when there was no money to buy it. He was just an ordinary servant of God recording the extraordinary daily faithfulness of God, and now we have a 6-volume set of a man who just daily wrote down, this is what God did today. And I read that and I'm encouraged to remember God will meet my needs. His memorial, George Mueller's memorial, served, verse 24 again, that all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord. That all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty. It's okay if you're not George Mueller. Neither was he. Record what God does for you. and you will remember it. And if you remember it, there's a chance that God may take that and take that through to future generations. And so not only you, but your children, maybe even people you've never met or never thought of, will stand one day and say, the hand of the Lord is mighty. George Mueller's memorial served that people from the whole earth can know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and so could yours. So, preacher, what do you want me to do with this? Go get you a journal. Go make you a rock pile. Do something intentional and tangible to remember the goodness of God. And when the storm comes, when the battles are great, and when your children ask, tell me about your God, you can say more than just, well, God's been good. No, you can give 31,000 pages of the goodness and the faithfulness of God. Father, now I pray that you'll take your word.